I used to think stability was the same thing as happiness. That if nothing was breaking, then nothing needed fixing. From the outside, my life looked settled, even enviable. A steady relationship. Familiar routines. Someone who knew my habits, my silences, my moods. We shared a space, a history, a rhythm that had formed over years. And yet, somewhere along the way, that rhythm turned into background noise. Most days followed the same pattern. Wake up, exchange a few practical words, move through responsibilities, return home tired. We sat next to each other more than we faced each other. Conversations became updates instead of connections. We talked about work, bills, plans for someday, but rarely about how we actually felt. Not because we didn't care, but because it felt unnecessary to ask. We assumed we already knew that. I told myself this was normal. That this was what long-term love looked like when the excitement faded and real life took over. Comfort. Predictability. Safety. And for a while, that explanation worked. It helped me ignore the quiet heaviness in my chest when the day ended and nothing meaningful had happened between us. It helped me justify the way I sometimes felt lonelier with them than I ever did alone. There was no big argument. No betrayal. No obvious reason to feel dissatisfied. That made the emptiness worse. I felt ungrateful for wanting more, ashamed for feeling bored, selfish for craving something I couldn't even define. I loved them. I still do. That was the most confusing part. Love was there, but it felt distant, like a memory instead of a living thing that I noticed the change in small moments. The way we stopped laughing over nothing. The way silence stretched longer without feeling comfortable. The way I started keeping thoughts to myself because explaining them felt like too much effort. I wasn't hiding anything yet, but I was withdrawing. Slowly. Quietly. Almost politely. At night, lying beside someone who knew my body but not my mind anymore, I would stare at the ceiling and replay the day. Nothing bad had happened. And that was the problem. Nothing good had happened either. It felt like I was watching my own life from a distance, participating just enough to keep everything running, but never fully present. That I started wondering when I had last felt excited about anything that wasn't a plan or a responsibility. When I had last felt seen without having to explain myself. When I had last felt chosen, not out of habit, but out of desire. Those questions scared me, so I pushed them down and told myself to be patient. To be mature. To be grateful. Trying something new wasn't a decision at first. It was a thought. A whisper. A harmless curiosity that showed up when I was tired of pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to cheat. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to feel alive again, even if that feeling came from somewhere unexpected. That I convinced myself that wanting more didn't mean I loved less. That questioning my happiness didn't automatically make me a bad person. I told myself everyone feels this way sometimes, that relationships go through phases, that this would pass if I ignored it long enough. But the truth has a way of staying, even when you don't invite it. There was a growing gap between who I was and who I pretended to be. Outwardly calm, inwardly restless. Faithful in action, but drifting in thought. I hadn't crossed any lines, but I was standing close enough to see them clearly. And instead of stepping back, I lingered. Looking back, I realized this was the moment everything started to shift. Not because I did something wrong, but because I stopped listening to what was right. I mistook silence for peace and routine for security. I didn't understand then that neglect doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like staying, while slowly disappearing, that I didn't know yet that trying something new would change everything. I only knew that staying exactly the same was quietly breaking me.
It didn't take long for what we had to become something I started depending on. At first, it was occasional. A message here, a conversation there. But slowly, without either of us acknowledging it, a pattern formed. He became part of my day in a way that felt natural and necessary. I would catch myself waiting for his messages, rereading them when they came, noticing how even the smallest words from him carried more weight than entire conversations at home. He never tried too hard. That was the difference. There was no chasing, no exaggeration, no need to impress. He spoke with intention, and somehow that made every interaction feel more real. When he asked how I was, it wasn't a habit, it was a question he expected an honest answer to. And I gave it. I told him things I hadn't said out loud before. Not because I planned to, but because with him, silence didn't feel like protection, it felt unnecessary. He had a way of pulling the truth out without forcing it. A calm persistence. A quiet authority that made it easier to let go of the walls I didn't even realize I had built, and I let them fall. Days started to feel divided. There was the version of me that existed in my marriage, measured, careful, distant. And then there was the version of me that came alive in those conversations with him. More open. More honest. More present. I didn't question that contrast as much as I should have. Instead, I leaned into it. He began to understand me in ways that felt unsettling. He would notice things I didn't say. Pauses in my words. Shifts in my tone. And instead of ignoring them, he addressed them directly, like he saw through everything I tried to hide. It should have made me uncomfortable. It didn't. It made me feel known, and being known is addictive. At home, the distance grew quieter but heavier. My husband didn't suddenly change. If anything, he stayed exactly the same. But I wasn't seeing him the same way anymore. The gap between what I felt and what I needed became impossible to ignore. I stopped trying to bridge it. I told myself I was just tired, but the truth was, I had already started to detach. There were moments when I caught myself comparing them. Not intentionally, not out loud, but the thoughts came anyway. One listened. One didn't. One noticed. One overlooked. One made me feel like I mattered without asking for it. And once those comparisons begin, they don't stop. Our conversations deepened. What started as simple exchanges turned into something layered, something that carried meaning even in silence. There were pauses that lingered longer than necessary, words that felt heavier than they should have. It wasn't just what we said, it was what we didn't say that changed everything. He never crossed a line directly, but he stood close enough to it that I could feel it. And I didn't step back. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable on the surface, that changed the way I saw everything. We were standing closer than usual, not touching, but aware of the space between us. It wasn't accidental. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Time didn't stop, but it slowed enough for me to feel the weight of that silence. I could have walked away. I didn't, because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I wanted this. Not just the conversations, not just the attention. Him. The way he made me feel grounded and exposed at the same time. The way his presence alone was enough to quiet everything else in my mind. That realization should have scared me. Instead, it settled in quietly, like something I had been avoiding finally finding its place. The shift after that was subtle, but irreversible. There was no need to pretend things were neutral anymore. The way we spoke changed. Softer in some ways, more direct in others. There was an understanding between us now, unspoken, but undeniable. I started to let go of the guilt in small pieces, not completely. It was still there, lingering in the background, reminding me of what I was risking. But it wasn't strong enough to stop me. Not when I finally felt something I had been missing for so long. I told myself it wasn't physical. That nothing had actually happened, but I knew better because what we had, it wasn't harmless anymore. It was intentional. Every message, every pause, every look that lasted a second too long, it all meant something. And I was no longer trying to ignore it. There was a moment, quiet and unguarded, when the words slipped out of me without planning. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft enough to carry everything I couldn't fully explain. Something that revealed more than I had intended, something that hinted at trust and surrender. I didn't take it back. He didn't question it. And in that silence that followed, I felt it clearly, the line I had been avoiding, the one I thought I still had control over, that I had crossed it. Not in a way anyone else could see. Not in a way that could be proven or explained, but inside, where it mattered most, there was no doubt anymore that I wasn't just someone having conversations, that I was someone who had already chosen a direction, even if I hadn't admitted it out loud. And once that choice is made, even quietly, there's no going back to who you were before. It started to feel heavier than it had any right to. What once felt effortless began to demand attention. I was no longer just responding, I was anticipating, adjusting, hiding. Every interaction carried weight now, and with that weight came something I hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge before, pressure that I had built, something I couldn't openly hold. The messages didn't stop, but the way I received them changed. I read into everything. If he took longer to reply, I noticed. If his tone shifted even slightly, I questioned it. The same calm presence that once grounded me now had the power to unsettle me, and I hated how quickly that happened, because it meant I wasn't in control anymore. At home, the distance had turned into something sharper. It wasn't just silence now, it was awareness. My husband didn't say much, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to understand something he couldn't quite reach. There were pauses between us that felt different, heavier, as if something unsaid was pressing against both of us. He asked simple questions more often than I gave simple answers. Neither of us pushed further. That was the unspoken agreement: don't dig too deep, and nothing has to break. But things were already breaking. Living in two emotional realities started to take its toll. I couldn't fully exist in either one. With one, I felt detached. With the other, I felt consumed. There was no balance, no middle ground. Just a constant pull in opposite directions that left me exhausted. And still, I didn't stop, because despite everything, I needed him. Not in a way I could justify logically, but in a way that felt real enough to ignore the consequences. He had become the place I went to feel steady, even as everything around me started to unravel. That contradiction should have been enough to wake me up. It wasn't, but then something shifted, not dramatically. Not in a way that could be clearly pointed out. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. The consistency I had relied on from him started to crack. He wasn't always there in the same way anymore. The replies came, but sometimes they felt distant. The conversations continued, but something underneath them had changed. I felt it immediately, and for the first time, I questioned him the way I had once questioned myself. It wasn't fear of losing him exactly. It was the realization that I had placed myself in a position where I could be affected this deeply by someone who wasn't truly mine. That the sense of safety I had built around him wasn't as solid as I believed. When I finally confronted him, it wasn't loud or emotional. It came out controlled, almost too calm, like I was trying to hold on to dignity while everything inside me was unsettled. I asked what had changed. He didn't avoid the question. He just didn't answer it the way I expected. Instead of reassurance, he gave me honesty. Not harsh, not cruel, just direct. He asked me something in return, something simple but impossible to answer without stripping everything down to the truth. What do you actually want? The question stayed longer than anything else he had ever said to me, because I didn't have a clean answer. I wasn't just choosing between two people. I was choosing between comfort and truth, between familiarity and something that felt real but unstable. And the worst part was realizing that neither option came without loss. I had told myself this was about feeling seen, about filling an emotional gap. But standing there in that moment, I understood it went deeper than that. I hadn't just been drawn to him, I had been escaping something in myself. Avoiding the parts of my life that felt empty by replacing them with something intense enough to distract me. And now that intensity was starting to fade into something more complicated, something less certain. The control I thought I had over the situation slipped quietly. I wasn't guiding anything anymore. I was reacting, adjusting, trying to hold on to something that was no longer as steady as it once felt. At home, the tension finally surfaced. It didn't explode, it unfolded slowly. A question asked with too much meaning behind it. A look that lasted longer than it should have. My husband didn't accuse me directly, but he didn't need to. The distance between us had become obvious enough to speak for itself. For a moment, I thought about telling the truth, not everything. Just enough to explain why things felt broken, but the words never came because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I stayed quiet. And that silence said more than any confession could. Everything I had been holding together started to collapse in pieces. Not all at once, but enough to leave me standing in something I no longer recognized. The emotional certainty I had once felt was gone. In its place was something uncertain, unstable, and impossible to fully control. I had stepped into something thinking it would give me clarity. Instead, it left me exposed. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't thinking about what I wanted, I was thinking about what I had already lost. Because somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I had let go of the one thing I thought would always remain intact, and now, standing between two incomplete realities, I wasn't anchored to either one. Just alone in the space I created. Silence feels different when it's no longer shared. There are no messages waiting for me anymore. No familiar name lighting up my screen. No quiet pull drawing my attention away from everything else. Just space, uninterrupted, unfilled, honest in a way I avoided for too long. At first, I thought I would miss him the most, but what lingered wasn't just him. It was the version of myself that existed around him. The one who felt understood without trying, who didn't have to explain why she was tired or distant or unsure. That version felt real, but it wasn't complete because it only existed in contrast to something else, and now, with that contrast gone, I'm left with what's actually mine. The quiet in my home hasn't changed much. The same walls, the same routines, the same distance sitting between two people who no longer pretend not to notice it. But there's a difference now. Before, I filled that silence with distraction. Now, I sit in it, and I listen not to him. Not to what used to be to myself. It's uncomfortable in a way I didn't expect. There's no one to lean toward, no one to escape into. Just the weight of every choice I made, every line I crossed without calling it that. I don't get to soften it anymore or rename it into something easier to carry. I know what it was, and I know what it cost. I haven't tried to reach out to him. Not because I don't think about it, but because I understand now that whatever we had was never built to last. It existed in a space where reality didn't fully apply. A space where I could take parts of myself I didn't want to face and hand them over to someone who made them feel lighter. But borrowed clarity always comes with a return, and when it does, it takes everything with it. I used to think he gave me something I didn't have. Now I see it differently. He showed me what I was missing, and I chose the easiest way to feel it instead of the hardest way to fix it. There's a difference between being seen and being understood. I confused the two because one felt immediate, and the other required time, effort, and honesty I wasn't ready to give. Not just to my husband. To myself, that realization doesn't come with relief. It comes with responsibility. The kind you can't shift onto anyone else, no matter how much you want to. I can't blame distance alone. I can't blame neglect alone. Those things existed, yes, but they weren't the decision. I was. The marriage I'm in now feels unfamiliar, even though nothing about it is new. We move around each other carefully, like we both know something has changed but haven't agreed on how to name it. There's no confrontation waiting, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet understanding that whatever we were before doesn't exist the same way anymore, and maybe it hasn't for a long time. I don't know what happens next for us. I don't try to predict it anymore. For the first time, I'm not reaching for an outcome, I'm sitting with the truth of where things stand. Uncertain, incomplete, but real. That's more honest than anything I've held on to recently. I've stopped looking for distractions. Stopped waiting for something or someone to pull me out of this stillness. Because I understand now that every time I avoided it, I was just delaying something I eventually had to face myself. Not the version shaped by someone else's attention. Not the version reacting to absence. Just the one that exists underneath all of that, stripped of excuses and softened narratives. It's not easy to stay here, but it's necessary because no matter how far I tried to step outside of my own life, I never actually left it. I just complicated it. Layered it with emotions that felt meaningful in the moment but couldn't survive outside of it. What I called connection was real, but incomplete. What I called escape was temporary, but damaging, and what I avoided is the only thing that remains. There are moments when I almost reach for my phone, out of habit more than anything. A reflex I haven't fully unlearned yet. But I stop myself now, not because I'm forcing distance, but because I finally understand what crossing that line did to me. It didn't fix anything. It just revealed everything I didn't want to see. And now that I've seen it, I don't get to pretend I haven't. I don't know if things will ever go back to how they were. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe the point isn't to return to something comfortable, but to move forward with something honest even if it's uncertain. For the first time, I'm not asking who will stay or who will leave, but I'm asking who I am without needing either, because in the end, it was never about who I belonged to. It was about the parts of myself I gave away, and whether I have the strength to take them back.